Hey there, wake up. It's Means Morning News. Just after 11 a.m. on the East Coast, I'm Sam Sachs. Here are today's stories brought to you by our sponsor, Frog Talk, a show featuring two frogs who talk about cars. Find it wherever you get your podcasts. Now on to the news. The Trump administration's showdown with the judiciary has reached another crescendo, with a federal judge in Washington, D.C. finding probable cause to hold officials in contempt for violating his court order. In a ruling on Wednesday, Judge James Boasberg accused the government of, quote, deliberate or reckless disregard when it refused to comply with his order last month to turn around plane loads of Venezuelan migrants headed to a torture prison in El Salvador so that they'd have a chance to challenge their removal under the Alien Enemies Act. The government, of course, didn't turn the planes around, and since then, DOJ attorneys have refused to hand over information about the flights to the court, further angering the judge and leading to this week's contempt findings. Boasberg wrote, quote, "The court ultimately determines that the government's actions on that day demonstrate a willful disregard for its order, sufficient for the court to conclude that probable cause exists to find the government in criminal contempt." Boasberg then outlined what the next steps will be in this case. First, the government can purge this contempt by finally agreeing to the court's original restraining order and allowing the deported migrants to challenge their removal in court. If the government chooses not to do that, then Boasberg writes the court will require written declarations from officials to determine who is in contempt. It could even hold live hearings with witness testimony under oath. And following that, Judge Boasberg will refer the contempt charges to the Department of Justice for prosecution. And if the DOJ refuses to prosecute, then the court will use special powers to appoint its own attorney to prosecute the contempt charges. The Trump administration is also facing potential contempt charges from a federal judge in Maryland over its refusal to abide by a court order to bring Maryland resident Kilmar Abrego Garcia back to the U.S. so he can have his due process rights respected as well. Abrego Garcia was one of the men on the planes flown to El Salvador, even though a judge had given him protected status against such a deportation. On Wednesday, U.S. Senator Chris Van Hollen flew to El Salvador, hoping to bring his constituent Abrego Garcia back with him. But after meeting with U.S. Embassy staff and the Salvadoran vice president, the senator was blocked from seeing or even being able to speak with Abrego Garcia. Here's Van Hollen addressing reporters about what he learned.
There's no evidence that they're complying with that, or in fact, the United States Embassy here has told me they've received no direction from the Trump administration to help facilitate his release. So I asked the vice president if Abrego Garcia has not committed a crime, and the U.S. courts have found that he was illegally taken for the United States, and the government of El Salvador has no evidence that he was part of MS-13. Why is El Salvador continuing to hold him in CCOT? And his answer was that the Trump administration is paying El Salvador, the government of El Salvador, to keep him at CCOT.
So to recap, the U.S. government is saying they don't have the power to bring Abrego Garcia back to the U.S. because he's under the jurisdiction of El Salvador now. And the Salvadoran government is saying they can't release Abrego Garcia because the U.S. is paying them to keep him in prison. It's all pretty fucking heinous. As Van Hollen was in El Salvador, the White House convened an emergency press briefing to attack him. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt tweeted ahead of it, quote, "Press briefing at 4:30 p.m. with a special guest. Tune in." That special guest ended up being another constituent of Senator Van Hollen's, Patty Morin, whose daughter Rachel Morin was murdered back in 2023 by an immigrant from El Salvador. As sad as that case is, though, it has absolutely nothing to do with whether or not Abrego Garcia has due process rights. And the White House knows that. But it's trying to appeal to our lizard brains, trying to convince the fearful and xenophobic out there that somehow it's bad to advocate for a Salvadoran man who's locked in a torture prison with no charge, because years ago, a different Salvadoran man committed a murder. All of this is meant to distract from the fundamental issue here, which is this. Can the federal government arrest someone living in the U.S., someone who could be a coworker of yours, someone who could be married to a U.S. citizen or the parent of a U.S. citizen? Can they be taken and hurried onto a plane and thrown in a foreign prison known for human rights abuses where they'll remain indefinitely without having any chance to challenge their deportation or detention in court and without the government having to present any evidence to justify any of it? Is that something that the American president should have the power to do? This is what's at stake. And if the courts ultimately can't stop this or won't stop this, then the citizenry will have to. They can't deport all of us to El Salvador. Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg testified in court this week, defending his company from the most significant antitrust challenge it's faced in its entire existence. Federal Trade Commission is suing the social media giant known as Meta over its previous acquisitions of Instagram and WhatsApp, which the agency argues is monopolistic. If it loses, Meta could be forced to divest from the two products, which, let's face it, are lifelines since the youngs don't really use Facebook anymore. According to the FTC's lawsuit, Facebook initially struggled to get a foothold amid the rise of smartphones, and rather than innovate, it set out to buy what were at the time's nascent apps like Instagram and WhatsApp. And the companies it couldn't buy, it tried to sabotage by blocking them from accessing audiences across Facebook. Strong piece of evidence the agency has are internal emails from Zuckerberg revealing the business strategy at the time. One message in particular showed the motivation behind buying Instagram. Zuckerberg wrote in January 2012, quote, "I think photos in general, and certainly in conjunction with mobile, is a weak spot for us, yet represents a large part of many users' engagement on Facebook. I view this as both a significant threat from Google, Picasa, Android, Instagram, etc., and opportunity. I think this area should be a priority for us organically and through mergers and acquisitions, especially given competitive dynamics." In another email a month later, Zuckerberg wrote that it's time to consider buying Instagram to neutralize a competitor. Quote, "One business question I've been thinking about recently is how much we should be willing to pay to acquire mobile app companies like Instagram. The businesses are nascent, but the networks are established, the brands are already meaningful, and if they grow to a large scale, they could be very disruptive to us." Now, this case was actually started during the first Trump administration. It was tossed out of court in 2021 and then revived on sounder legal footing by former FTC chair, the aggressive Lina Khan. She's since been replaced by Trump, so this is the first major showdown between a powerful tech company and Trump's FTC, now headed by Andrew Ferguson. It'll put to the test Ferguson's pledge when he took the job to aggressively take on big tech. And it will also be a test of how much Zuckerberg's attempts to ingratiate himself to the White House over the last few months through a MAGA rebranding have worked. Since Trump's election, Zuckerberg unveiled new Facebook rules loosening up on hate speech and harassment, often deployed by the right, on the social media platform. He also gave a bunch of money to Trump's inauguration committee and got a seat on stage during the ceremony just behind the first family, alongside other tech oligarchs. And he's staffed Facebook up with former government regulators. Earlier this month, Zuckerberg actually came to Washington and met with Trump in the Oval Office to talk about the case. And according to the Wall Street Journal, Zuckerberg called FTC Chair Ferguson with an offer to settle for only $450 million, a fraction of the amount the agency was seeking, which is at least $18 billion. Zuckerberg later offered $1 billion, but so far no deal. The paper reported, quote, "On the call, Zuckerberg sounded confident that President Trump would back him up with the FTC, said people familiar with the matter. The billionaire Facebook co-founder had been developing closer ties to Trump. His company donated $1 million to Trump's inauguration and settled a $25 million lawsuit, and had been pressing the president in recent weeks to intervene in the monopoly lawsuit." For now, though, the trial continues, and Sheryl Sandberg is testifying. She was Meta's chief operating officer during the time of the acquisitions of Instagram and WhatsApp. The biggest threat to the predatory for-profit tax filing industry is about to be neutralized by President Trump. The Associated Press reported that the IRS now plans to eliminate its direct file program, which gave taxpayers an easy-to-use free option to file their basic income taxes, as opposed to paying companies like H&R Block, TurboTax, and TaxSlayer, in some cases hundreds of dollars to do it. In 2024, the first year the direct file option was deployed as a pilot program, more than 140,000 people used it. Numbers aren't available yet to see how many people used it this filing season. IRS staff are instructed to stop working on the program for 2026, the AP reported, an order that likely came from Doge components embedded in the agency. For-profit tax filing companies make billions of dollars every year from customers transmitting their tax information to the government that in many cases the government already knows. And those companies spend millions of dollars lobbying to preserve this ridiculous system, to defeat the expansion of free options like the IRS direct file program. And it appears they've won again, for now. Turning to other news related to the Internal Revenue Service, Lever News reported on what it's described as a massive scandal, even by Trump-era standards. It involves the president's nominee to lead the IRS, former Congressman Billy Long. Over the span of just a few weeks in January, after Long's nomination was announced, deep-pocketed individuals maxed out donations to Long's defunct campaign committee in order to help him pay off a $130,000 debt he accumulated, injecting his own money into a failed Senate bid. Here it is from the Lever. Quote, "The committee suddenly raked in nearly $137,000 in less than 3 weeks in January, money that Long then used to remunerate himself. In all, more than 2/3 of the contributions that flowed to Long's committee in January were for $2,900, the maximum allowed for the 2020 election cycle. At least 1/3 of the money came from donors working at firms in the tax consultancy industry or involved in major tax-related legal battles. Those firms include White River Energy and Lifetime Advisors, two companies that have been implicated in a fraud scheme in which they were selling bogus tax credits to individuals and businesses. Long himself worked a stint at Lifetime Advisors after he left Congress, where he too sold sketchy tax credits, one of them being the Employee Retention Tax Credit, which the IRS considers the most fraud-ridden credit out there and has even stopped accepting it. Both White River Energy and Lifetime Advisors were named in a letter this week from Senate Finance Committee members Ron Wyden and Catherine Cortez Masto, calling for a federal investigation into the fraudulent tax credit schemes. If confirmed, Long would be indebted to the same tax scheming companies that just bailed him out and could use his position as IRS director to protect them. Not a great situation. Labor unions are organizing to protect their members from Trump's onslaught on the federal workforce. A coalition of legal groups and unions unveiled the Rise Up Federal Workers Legal Defense Fund. The AFL-CIO, the AFGE, the National Employment Law Project, and other organizations are behind it. The project connects a network of pro bono lawyers trained in labor law to federal workers who've been affected by Trump's purges or dismantling of their rights. The AFGE said in a statement announcing the initiative, quote, "Since January, thousands of federal workers have been abruptly fired and thrown out of jobs their families and communities rely on. They have an urgent need for legal support, which will only escalate throughout the spring as reduction in force plans go into effect. Federal workers' unions and allied organizations are already fighting back in court, but thousands of federal workers still need individual legal advice and representation. Rise Up will provide legal services like free initial phone calls and follow-up consultation sessions to federal workers. And the group has already set up more than 1,000 lawyers in 42 states. Only 4 months into his term, and Trump has already forced out 60,000 civil servants across the federal government, with intentions to fire hundreds of thousands more. For this week in working class history, we're sailing back to 1919 Ireland for the short-lived Limerick Soviet. The Irish War for Independence had just kicked off, and British authorities declared the city of Limerick a special military area and required residents to carry a permit to move about it. That led to people getting hassled by police as they went to and from work. The situation was intolerable, a violation of civil rights, according to the Limerick Trades and Labor Council. And so, the union declared a general strike that brought upwards of 14,000 workers into the streets of the city to protest against the military occupation. Within days, the strike took the form of a revolution in the city. The workers took over the city government, services, and main industries and declared it the Limerick Soviet, drawing inspiration from the establishment of worker-led governments known as Soviets during the Russian Revolution 2 years earlier. The Limerick Soviet took over governing of the city, distributed goods to residents, maintained public order, printed its own newspaper, and established its own currency. Committees were set up to run city services like transportation and sanitation. And so Ireland's fourth largest city was suddenly under the control of its workers. And it was cool as hell. Unfortunately, beyond support from labor unions and international worker organizations, there was little buy-in elsewhere in Ireland for the revolutionary project. The church was opposed to it, along with most other political parties, including the ones that opposed British rule. A lack of support and a looming British military attack led to the dissolution of the Soviet less than 2 weeks after it was formed. The Trade Council voted to end the strike, and Limerick's workers returned to their job, and British authorities recaptured the city's administration. While the workers failed to create their own alternative government, they did succeed in what they initially set out to do. British authorities repealed their designation of Limerick as a special military area, and residents were no longer required to carry permits to move about. The establishment of the Soviet is still celebrated in Limerick. Back in 2019, the city held a festival to commemorate its 100-year anniversary that included reenactments. Pretty cool. Thanks as always to the team at Working Class History for giving us access to their archives. Follow them on social media at Working Class History to learn more about the Limerick Soviet and other events that happened this week in Working Class History, including the 1913 Belgian General Strike, the 1914 Ludlow Massacre, and the 1943 Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Back with more next week. Okay, friends, the show ends today with a sunrise from South Carolina. It was sent in by Blaze in Cedar Creek with a cameo from a dog named Angus McFangus. Enjoy. Thank you, Blaze, and thank you, Angus McFangus. Show's over. Thanks for watching, and thanks to the team behind the scenes. Please sign up for Means TV, subscribe to our YouTube and podcast channels, and follow us on social media. One day, capitalism will fall. Until then, we're going to be right here. See you tomorrow.